I remember the taste of fear. It had a flavor all its own, metallic and bitter, coating the back of my throat like the recaf we used to brew in the barracks before the world ended. Before the sky filled with spores and the horizon writhed with chitinous bodies that blotted out the sun, I was a guardsman of the Imperial Guard, a number among billions, a las rifle and a flak vest and a prayer to the God Emperor, and I was going to die on a world whose name I never learned how to pronounce. They told us it was called Terteus 9 during the briefing, but the commissar who gave us our orders had an accent thick as promethium sludge, and by the time we made Planetfall, half the regiment was calling it something different. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The world had one purpose now, one function in the great machine of the Imperium's war: to be defended until every man, woman, and child upon it was dead, and then to be mourned in a footnote of some administratum ledger filed away in the bowels of a hive city I would never see. The drop was routine. That should have been my first warning. 20 years in the Guard teaches you that routine is the universe's way of lulling you into complacency before it tears your guts out. We descended through the atmosphere in Valkyries, packed shoulder to shoulder, the smell of recycled air, and nervous sweat thick enough to choke on. I sat between Mikhail and Joss, 2 men I'd served with for 3 campaigns. Mikhail was tall, rangy, with a scar across his temple from a greenskin's blade on Arthur's world. Joss was compact, quiet, the kind of soldier who cleaned his las rifle 3 times a day and never spoke unless spoken to. We didn't talk during the descent. There was nothing to say. We'd done this 100 times before, dropping into hell with a lasgun and the Emperor's benediction, expected to hold whatever line they drew in the dirt until the line broke or we did. The pilot's voice crackled over the vox, distorted by static and distance. 60 seconds to LZ. Emperor protects. 60 seconds. I counted them in my head, each one a heartbeat, each heartbeat a prayer I barely remembered the words to. The litanies they taught us in training had long since blurred together into a single monotonous drone, the kind of thing you recite while your hands work automatically, stripping and reassembling your weapon, checking your charge packs, tightening the straps on your helmet. My flak armor was old, third hand at least, the ceramite plates cracked and poorly repaired with industrial adhesive. I could see the seams where someone had tried to patch a last burn across the chest piece. I wondered if the man who'd worn it before me had died. I wondered if he'd died quickly. The Valkyrie shuddered as we hit turbulence, and someone behind me retched. The smell of vomit joined the cocktail of odors in the troop bay. Nobody laughed. Nobody even acknowledged it. We were all too focused on the countdown, on the moment when the assault ramp would drop, and we'd spill out into whatever fresh hell Command had decided we were worth spending on. The engines screamed, a high-pitched wail that rattled my teeth in my skull. And then we were banking hard, spiraling down through what sounded like anti-aircraft fire, but was probably just atmospheric interference. Or so I told myself. I'd learned a long time ago that hope was a luxury, but self-deception was free. The impact when we hit the ground was bone-jarring. The Valkyrie bounced once, twice, and then the ramp dropped with a hydraulic hiss, and we were moving, pouring out into the grey dawn of an alien world. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual stench of a battlefield burnt promethium and ozone and blood. This was organic, fecund, like a slaughterhouse left to rot under a summer sun. It clogged my nostrils and made my eyes water. The second thing I noticed was the sound, a chittering, clicking cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a noise that made my skin crawl and my fingers tighten on my las rifle. The third thing I noticed was the ground. It wasn't ground anymore. It was a carpet of something purple and fibrous, a living mat that squelched under my boots and released puffs of spores with every step. "Form up! Form up!" Sergeant Draven was shouting, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Defensive perimeter! Now!" We moved automatically, muscle memory and training overriding the terror that threatened to freeze us in place. I found myself next to Joss, both of us dropping into a crouch behind a ridge of what might have once been rockcrete but was now partially digested, dissolved by some acidic secretion that had turned it into a porous, honeycombed nightmare. I could see movement in the distance, a rippling across the landscape like wind through grass, except the grass was the color of bone, and it was moving toward us with purpose and speed. "Contact front!" someone screamed, and then the world exploded into violence. They came in a wave, a living tide of claws and teeth and hunger. Hormagaunts, the data slates had called them during the briefing, but the technical designation did nothing to prepare me for the reality. They were fast, inhumanly fast, their bodies low to the ground and serpentine in their movements, closing the distance between us with terrifying efficiency. I fired, we all fired. The air lit up with las fire. Brilliant crimson beams that carved through chitin and flesh, with satisfying cracks and hisses. I saw one of them stumble, its chest cavity blown open, purple ichor spraying from the wound, and then it was up again, still coming, still hungry. I fired again, and again, my las rifle hot in my hands, the charge pack's indicator blinking amber as it depleted. Next to me, Joss was firing in controlled bursts, his face a mask of concentration. Mikhail was somewhere to my left. I could hear him shouting prayers to the Emperor between shots, his voice cracking with the strain. The sergeant was still barking orders, trying to maintain some semblance of cohesion, but it was chaos, pure and absolute. The Hormagaunts were among us now, leaping over the barricades we'd erected, tearing into the men in the rear ranks with scything talons that opened throats and bellies with surgical precision. I heard screaming, high-pitched and desperate, and smelled the copper stink of fresh blood mixing with that underlying organic rot. I pivoted, bringing my las rifle around, and fired point-blank into the face of a creature that had lunged at me, its jaws wide enough to swallow my head whole. The beam punched through its skull and out the back, spraying me with hot gore that burned where it touched my skin. The creature collapsed at my feet, twitching, and I kicked it away, already searching for the next target. There was always a next target. They were endless, a sea of teeth and claws that crashed against our line like waves against a cliff, and we were eroding, dying, one soldier at a time. Fall back to secondary positions. Draven's voice again, ragged now, barely audible over the cacophony. I didn't question it. I turned and ran, keeping low. Joss at my side. Behind us, I could hear the wet sounds of talons meeting flesh, the crunch of bone, the gurgling last breaths of men who'd stood their ground a second too long. We reached a shell crater 50 meters back, reinforced with sandbags that were already dissolving where the creep had touched them, and threw ourselves down. I was gasping for air, my lungs burning, my hands shaking so badly I could barely reload my las rifle. "How many?" Joss asked, his voice steady despite the blood splattered across his face. "I don't know," I said, because I didn't. Dozens, hundreds, more than we could count, more than we could kill. They kept coming, wave after wave, and each wave thinned our numbers a little more. I could see the front line collapsing, men breaking and running, and the commissar, a tall, gaunt figure in a black greatcoat, executing a fleeing trooper with his bolt pistol, the man's head vaporizing in a red mist. The message was clear. Death in front of us or death behind us, but death regardless. The Emperor's mercy was a bullet to the brain if you were lucky. We held that position for 3 hours, or maybe it was 3 minutes. Time lost all meaning when you were fighting for your life, when every second stretched into an eternity of terror and adrenaline. My las rifle's barrel was glowing cherry red, the heat shimmering the air above it, and I'd burned through 6 charge packs. My shoulders ached from the recoil, my ears rang from the constant din of battle, and I was pretty sure I'd pissed myself at some point, but couldn't remember when. Joss had taken a glancing blow to the shoulder, his flak armor cracked but intact, purple ichor staining the ceramite. Mikhail was dead. I'd seen him go down, dragged screaming into the writhing mass of bodies, his las rifle firing wildly until it fell silent. I didn't have time to mourn him. I barely had time to register he was gone. By the time the sun reached its zenith, a pale, sickly thing barely visible through the spore clouds we'd been pushed back to the ruins of what the locals had called a settlement. It was nothing now. Just skeletal structures of corroded metal and crumbling stone, their surfaces covered in that same purple creep that was consuming the planet. The smell was worse here, concentrated, and I could see why. There were bodies, hundreds of them. Civilians, their corpses partially dissolved, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and terror. Some of them had been torn apart, limbs scattered like discarded toys. Others had wounds that suggested something had been feeding on them. I tried not to look too closely. I tried not to think about what it meant, that we were fighting to defend a world that was already lost. "Dig in," Sergeant Draven ordered, his voice hoarse and flat. He'd lost his helmet somewhere, and there was a long gash across his scalp that matted his hair with blood. "Command says reinforcements are coming. We hold here until they arrive." Nobody believed him. We could all hear the doubt in his voice, the resignation. But we dug in anyway, because that's what guardsmen do. We followed orders, even when those orders were suicidal, even when we knew command was lying. We scraped out firing positions in the ruins, stacked rubble to create makeshift barricades, and tried to convince ourselves that we had a chance. I found myself in what might have once been a domicile, its walls half collapsed, the floor slick with some kind of mucus-like secretion. Joss was with me, and 3 others I didn't know well. A woman named Karia, with a las carbine and a missing finger. A young man who couldn't have been more than 18, his face pale, and his hands trembling. And a grizzled veteran named Tom, who'd lost an eye on some campaign I'd never heard of, and wore a crude augmetic patch bolted directly to his skull. We waited. The chittering had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged, and the distant thump of artillery fire from somewhere over the horizon. The reinforcements Draven had mentioned, maybe, or just another regiment dying on another stretch of this Emperor-forsaken world. I checked my charge packs again. 4 left, and one of those was only half full. My water canteen was nearly empty, the liquid inside tasting faintly of rust and chemicals. I sipped it sparingly, knowing I'd need to make it last. There was no resupply coming. There was never resupply coming. "You think they'll really send help?" the young man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was looking at me with wide, hopeful eyes, and I hated him for it. I hated him for being young enough to still believe the Imperium gave a damn about individual soldiers, about men like us who were nothing but numbers on a casualty report. "No," I said, because lying seemed cruel. "We're on our own." He flinched, but he didn't argue. Tom snorted, a sound that might have been laughter in another context. Karia just stared out through a gap in the wall, her jaw clenched, her finger resting on the trigger of her carbine. Joss was silent, as always, his eyes distant. I wondered what he was thinking, if he was praying, if he was remembering the life he'd left behind when the Imperium had conscripted him. I never asked. Some things were too personal. Even in the face of annihilation, the attack, when it came, was different, smarter. They didn't rush us in a mindless wave this time. Instead, they probed our defenses, testing for weak points. Small groups of hormagaunts darting forward, and then retreating, drawing our fire, forcing us to waste ammunition. I could see larger shapes moving behind them, stalking through the ruins with a deliberate, predatory patience. Warriors, the briefing had called them, synapse creatures that coordinated the swarm, made it more than just a mindless horde. They were bigger, armored, their carapaces thick enough to shrug off las fire unless you hit a weak point. And they were smart. I watched one of them use a collapsed building for cover, its movements calculated, almost human in their cunning. It made my skin crawl. "Conserve ammunition," Draven shouted from somewhere deeper in the ruins. "Wait for clean shots." Clean shots. As if there was such a thing in this nightmare. I watched a warrior scuttle around the edge of my field of vision and fired, my last beam catching it in the upper torso. The creature staggered but didn't fall. its carapace smoking where I'd hit it, and then it was gone, vanished into the shadows. I cursed under my breath and ducked back behind cover as return fire, some kind of biological projectile weapon, spines or beetles, or something worse, splattered against the wall above my head, hissing as they dissolved the stone. The battle became a war of attrition, a slow grind that wore us down by degrees. We'd kill one of them, and 3 more would take its place. We'd hold a position for an hour, and then they'd flank us, and we'd have to retreat. Every withdrawal cost us men. Every stand cost us ammunition and hope. By the time the sun began to set, that same anemic orb sinking below a horizon thick with spore clouds, we'd lost half the platoon. Draven was dead, torn apart by a warrior that had breached our line. Carrier was dead, her throat opened by a glancing blow from a Hormagaunt's scything talon. The young man whose name I never learned was dead, dragged into the darkness while we were repositioning, his screams echoing long after his body disappeared. I was running on fumes. My last charge pack was blinking red, nearly depleted. My hands were blistered from gripping the hot metal of my Lazarifal. My throat was raw from shouting orders and prayers and curses. Joss was still with me, somehow, his shoulder wound leaking blood through a field dressing we'd hastily applied. Tom was there too, along with a handful of others I barely recognized through the grime and gore that covered us all. We'd consolidated into a single building at the center of the ruins, a squat, bunker-like structure that had probably been a storage facility or shrine. Its walls were thick, reinforced, and so far the creep hadn't penetrated inside. It was cold inside, the kind of bone-deep cold that seeped through your uniform and settled in your marrow. I could see my breath misting in the dim light from a flickering loom strip someone had managed to activate. "How long?" Tom asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Until what?" I replied, though I knew what he meant. "Until they overrun us." I didn't answer. The truth was obvious. We were already dead. We just hadn't finished dying yet. The Tyranids didn't need to rush. They could wait us out, starve us, pick us off one by one as exhaustion and fear broke us down. Or they could simply call in something bigger, one of the monstrous bio-titans the briefing had warned us about, creatures the size of buildings that could tear through fortifications like they were paper. Either way, the outcome was the same. We were meat, and they were the slaughterhouse. Outside, the chittering resumed, louder now, a symphony of hunger that made my teeth ache. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that resonated through the floor and walls, as if the entire world was being digested around us. The creep had advanced while we'd retreated, covering the ruins in a thick carpet of biomass that pulsed faintly in the darkness, bioluminescent in shades of sickly green and purple. I watched it through a firing slit, mesmerized despite myself, trying to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't just organic matter. It was intelligent, purposeful, a living infrastructure that was transforming the planet into something alien, something that existed solely to feed the hive fleet's insatiable appetite. "Movement," Joss said quietly, breaking me from my trance. I looked where he was pointing and saw shapes moving through the creep. Humanoid but wrong, their proportions distorted, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. It took me a moment to realize what they were. Gaunts, but different, smaller, weaker, and wearing the tattered remains of Imperial uniforms. "Emperor's mercy," someone whispered behind me, the words a prayer and a curse combined. They'd taken our dead, repurposed them, turned them into something that was neither human nor Xenos, just biomass shaped into a mockery of what it had once been. I could see faces I recognized, or thought I recognized, features half dissolved and reformed into something that made me want to vomit. Mikhail was there, or what remained of him, his body twisted and hunched, his arms ending in scythe-like appendages, his eyes, if they were eyes, glowing with a faint, malevolent light. They advanced on the bunker in a shambling mob, and behind them came the real threat. Warriors, a dozen at least, their weapons primed and aimed at our position. "Fire!" I shouted, and we opened up with everything we had. My last charge pack drained in seconds, the last beams cutting through the converted bodies with ease, reducing them to twitching piles of meat. But the warriors were harder to kill. They returned fire, their bio-weapons spitting projectiles that punched through the bunker's walls as if they were cloth. I heard someone scream as a spine embedded itself in their chest, the toxin on its tip working fast, dissolving flesh and bone from the inside out. The smell was indescribable, sweet and rotten and chemical, all at once, and I gagged as I slammed a fresh charge pack, my last, into my las rifle, and fired again. The wall to my left exploded inward, showering me with debris, and a warrior forced its way through the gap, its massive frame filling the opening. It was close enough that I could see the individual plates of its carapace, the clusters of eyes that covered its head, the dripping maw filled with rows of serrated teeth. I fired, point blank, the last beam punching through its thorax, and it shrieked, a sound that was part insect, part something worse, and collapsed half in and half out of the bunker. Its blood, if it was blood, was acidic, eating through the floor where it pooled, and I scrambled back before it could reach me. "We can't hold," Tom was shouting, firing his las rifle in short, controlled bursts, even as the wall behind him began to crack under sustained fire. "We need to move." Move where? I wanted to scream. There was nowhere left to go. The ruins were overrun. The planet was overrun. The whole damned sector was probably overrun by now. But I nodded anyway, because the alternative was standing still and dying, and some stubborn part of me, some animal part that refused to accept the inevitable, wanted to keep moving, keep fighting, even if it was pointless. We abandoned the bunker, bursting out through a side entrance that led into a narrow alley choked with creep. I could feel it squelching under my boots, could feel the heat radiating from it, as if the biomass itself was metabolizing, generating energy. The air was thick with spores, visible as a fine mist that caught in my lungs and made me cough. My vision was blurring, whether from exhaustion or the spores I couldn't tell, and I had to concentrate just to put one foot in front of the other. Joss was beside me, supporting me when I stumbled, his face set in grim determination. Tom was ahead, his augmetic eye glowing faintly in the darkness, scanning for threats. There were others behind us, maybe 3 or 4, but I couldn't turn to count them. I was too focused on not falling, not stopping, not giving up. We ran through the ruins for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Time had become meaningless, compressed into an eternal present, where the only thing that mattered was survival. We heard pursuit, the skittering of claws on stone, the wet breathing of creatures that didn't belong in a sane universe. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Stopping meant death, and death meant becoming part of the biomass, fuel for the hive fleet's endless hunger. We found ourselves at the edge of a ravine, a deep gouge in the landscape that might have been a riverbed once, before the Tyranids had drained it. The bottom was filled with creep, so thick it looked almost solid, and as I stared down into it I saw movement, shapes writhing beneath the surface, feeding or growing, or doing something I couldn't comprehend. There was a bridge, a narrow span of corroded metal that looked like it might collapse under our weight, but it was our only option. Tom started across first, moving carefully, testing each step, and I followed, my heart hammering in my chest. We were halfway across when the bridge shuddered. I looked back and saw them, hormagaunts, pouring out of the ruins behind us, a living carpet of chitin and claws. They weren't slowing down. They were going to hit the bridge at full speed, and when they did, the whole structure would come down, dumping us all into the ravine and the waiting horrors below. I fired my las rifle, the charge pack flickering red, warning me it was nearly depleted, but I didn't care. I just kept firing, trying to slow them down, trying to buy us a few more seconds. Tom made it to the other side and turned back, waving us on, his voice lost in the cacophony. Joss was next, moving as fast as his wounded shoulder would allow. I was right behind him, my boots slipping on the corroded metal, and then I felt the bridge lurch, a sickening drop that made my stomach flip. I looked down and saw the supports giving way, the metal groaning and shrieking as it buckled. I lunged forward, my hands reaching for the far side, and Joss caught me, hauling me up with strength I didn't know he still had. Behind me, the bridge collapsed with a deafening crash, taking the Hormagaunts with it. I heard them shrieking as they fell, and then the sound was cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, squelching noise that turned my stomach. I lay on the ground, gasping, my body shaking with adrenaline and terror. Joss was beside me, bleeding from his shoulder again, the field dressing soaked through. Tom was standing over us, his Lazrafal trained on the far side of the ravine, watching for any sign of pursuit. I could hear others behind me, survivors from our mad dash, but I didn't have the strength to turn and look at them. I just stared up at the sky, at the spore clouds that blotted out the stars, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in something. The Emperor's protection, the Imperium's strength, the idea that we were fighting for a cause greater than ourselves. But those were lies, comforting fictions we told ourselves to make sense of the senseless. The truth was simpler and infinitely more terrible. We were alone, abandoned, left to die on a world that was being consumed by an enemy that felt nothing, thought nothing, wanted nothing, except to feed. We were meat. That was all we had ever been. The ravine bought us time, but not much. We stumbled through the darkness, following Tom's lead, trusting his augmetic eye to guide us through terrain that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. The creep was everywhere now, covering the landscape in thick, ropey strands that connected to towering spires of biomass erupting from the ground like obscene monuments. I could hear sounds coming from within those spires. Wet, organic sounds, the grind of bone against bone, the squelch of flesh being molded into new forms. The Tyranids were building something, terraforming the planet into a digestion pool, and we were insects crawling through the alimentary canal of a god. We found what might have been an Imperial outpost, or the ruins of one. The walls were half consumed, the fortifications dissolving into the creep, but there was a basement level, a bunker carved into the bedrock, and it was still relatively intact. We descended a narrow stairway slick with condensation and mold, the smell of damp stone and rust overwhelming the organic stench for the first time in hours. The bunker was small, cramped, with barely enough room for the 6 of us who'd survived. Myself, Joss, Tom, and 3 others I'd barely spoken to. One was a woman named Rella, a heavy weapons trooper whose lascannon had been lost somewhere along the way, leaving her with just a stub pistol and a knife. Another was a medic, a soft-spoken man named Finn, who'd been trying to treat Joss's shoulder even as we moved, his hands shaking with exhaustion. The last was a commissar's aide, a boy no older than 16 who'd lost his commissar and seemed lost without someone to follow. We collapsed in the darkness, too tired to speak, too numb to do anything but breathe. My body was a map of pain, bruises, cuts, burns from hot metal and acidic blood. My throat was raw, my eyes stung from the spores, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking no matter how hard I tried to still them. Joss was unconscious or close to it, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Finn was working on him with the last of his medical supplies, a paltry collection of bandages and stims that wouldn't be enough if the wound was infected. I wanted to tell him to save his supplies, that we were all going to die anyway, but the words stuck in my throat. Hope was a lie, but so was despair when you voiced it aloud. Better to stay silent, to pretend we still had a chance. We should vox command, the aide said suddenly, his voice cracking. Let them know we're still alive. They'll send extraction, right? They have to. Nobody answered him. We all knew the truth. Command didn't care. We were expendable, replaceable, just another regiment ground to paste in the Imperium's endless wars. If they'd wanted to extract us, they would have done it hours ago, before the situation became untenable. The fact that we were still here, still fighting, meant we'd been written off. Acceptable losses, that's what we were called in the reports. Martyrs, for the Emperor, if they wanted to be poetic. Dead meat, if they were being honest. We need to rest, Tom said, his voice flat. 4 hours. Rotating watch. Then we move. Move where? Rella asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Away. Doesn't matter where. Staying in one place too long gets you killed. He was right, of course. Movement was survival, even if that survival was measured in hours instead of days. But I was so tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. A weariness that had seeped into my bones and settled there like sediment. I volunteered for first watch anyway, because sleep meant dreams, and I didn't want to see the faces of the dead, the men I'd fought beside, the civilians we'd failed to protect. Better to stay awake, to stay focused, to keep the horror at bay for a few more hours. The bunker was silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant, muffled chittering that penetrated even the thick stone walls. I sat near the entrance, my Lazariful across my lap, the charge pack flickering amber. I had 1 full charge pack left, plus the partial one in my rifle. 40 shots, maybe 50 if I was conservative, enough to kill a few hormagaunts, nowhere near enough to make a difference if they found us. I wondered if I should save the last shot for myself, avoid the horror of being torn apart, or worse, being taken alive and repurposed into one of those shambling mockeries I'd seen. The thought didn't horrify me as much as it should have. That scared me more than the Tyranids did. Time crawled. Every sound made me tense, my finger tightening on the trigger, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the bunker's entrance. I saw shapes that weren't there, heard footsteps that were just my imagination. The spores were affecting me, I realized. I could feel them in my lungs, in my blood, a creeping wrongness that made my thoughts sluggish and my vision blur. Finn had mentioned something about that in the Valkyrie, before we dropped. Tyranid spores weren't just invasive, they were mutagenic, slowly breaking down the body's defenses, preparing it for integration into the biomass. How long did I have before I stopped being human? How long before the creature looking out through my eyes wasn't me anymore? Tom relieved me after what he claimed was 4 hours, but felt like 40. I moved deeper into the bunker and tried to sleep, curling up on the cold stone floor, my Lazariful clutched to my chest like a child's toy. I drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully asleep, never fully awake, trapped in a liminal state where nightmares bled into reality. I saw Mikhail again, his body twisted and wrong, reaching for me with scythe arms, his mouth moving but producing only that terrible chittering sound. I saw the young man whose name I'd never learned, his face half dissolved, accusing me with eyes that wept purple ichor. I saw the sky split open and something vast and terrible descending, a shadow with teeth, and I woke with a start, biting back a scream. Joss was awake beside me, his eyes open but unfocused. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," I said, because what was the point of lying? "You, dying, I think. Shoulders infected. I can feel it spreading." He said it so matter-of-factly, without fear or anger, just stating a fact. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Finn would fix him, that we'd all get out of this somehow, but the lies wouldn't come. Instead, I just sat beside him in the darkness, listening to his labored breathing, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was Tom waking us all, his voice urgent. "They've found us. We need to move now." I scrambled to my feet, my body protesting, every muscle screaming. I could hear it now, the chittering, louder than before, echoing down the stairwell. They were in the outpost above us, searching, hunting. It was only a matter of time before they found the bunker entrance. We grabbed what little gear we had, mostly empty charge packs and broken dreams, and headed for the back of the bunker. Tom had found a maintenance tunnel during his watch, a narrow shaft that led into the bedrock, its purpose unknown but its direction away from the Tyranids. That was good enough. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a man, forcing us to move single file, hunched over, our shoulders scraping against the rough stone walls. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness that was absolute, suffocating, and I had to keep one hand on Joss's back to avoid losing him. My other hand gripped my Lazariful, though what good it would do in such a confined space, I couldn't say. If they found us here, in this tunnel, we'd be slaughtered like animals in a chute. But we moved forward anyway, because forward was the only direction that mattered. The tunnel branched, and branched again, becoming a labyrinth of passages that descended deeper into the earth. I lost track of time completely. It could have been minutes or hours, and I wouldn't have known the difference. My world had narrowed to the sound of breathing, the scrape of boots on stone, the weight of the rifle in my hand. Joss stumbled once, and I caught him, felt the heat radiating from his body. The infection was worse. He was burning up, his skin slick with sweat, and he was mumbling something under his breath, prayers or curses or nonsense. Finn tried to help, but there was nothing he could do. We were out of medical supplies, out of time, out of hope. We emerged into a chamber, a natural cavern that opened up around us with surprising suddenness. It was large, the ceiling lost in shadow, and there was a faint bioluminescence coming from patches of fungus or lichen that clung to the walls. It was beautiful, in a way, otherworldly, and for a moment I forgot where we were, forgot what was hunting us. Then I saw the bones. They were everywhere, scattered across the cavern floor. Human bones, Xenos bones, bones I couldn't identify. This place was a graveyard, a charnel pit, and we'd walked right into it. "We need to keep moving," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were all staring at the bones, all thinking the same thing. This was where we were going to die. Not in battle, not defending some nameless objective, but here, in the dark, surrounded by the remains of those who'd come before us. It seemed fitting, in a way. The Imperium ground its soldiers to dust, fed them into the war machine until there was nothing left, and this cavern was just another stomach in that vast, impersonal digestive system. We didn't make it 10 steps before they came. They poured out of the tunnels behind us, hormagaunts and worse, filling the cavern with their chittering, their hunger. We opened fire, the last beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating the cavern in stroboscopic flashes of red light. I saw Rella go down first, a hormagaunt's talons opening her throat, her blood black in the dim light. Finn was next, torn apart by 2 of them working in concert, his screams cut short as they fed. The aide tried to run, but there was nowhere to go, and he died alone, his body trampled under the swarm. Tom, Joss, and I formed a triangle, back to back, firing in all directions. My charge pack died mid-burst, and I slammed in my last one, my hands moving automatically, muscle memory overriding panic. Joss was barely standing, his las rifle firing wild, his aim gone, but he was still fighting. Tom was silent, methodical, each shot placed with precision, but even he couldn't hold them back forever. There were too many, and we were too few, and the end was written in the bones beneath our feet. My final charge pack ran dry. I heard the click, that damning sound that meant I was done, and I let the las rifle fall, reaching instead for my combat knife, a pathetic 10-inch blade that was more tool than weapon. A hormagaunt lunged at me, and I met it with the knife, driving it into the creature's throat, feeling its hot blood spray across my face and chest. It died, but its momentum carried it forward, knocking me down, and suddenly I was on my back, staring up at the cavern ceiling, at the shadows that danced across the stone. I felt claws rake across my chest, felt the ceramite of my flak armor crack and give way, felt the hot bloom of pain as talons opened my flesh. I tried to scream, but there was no air in my lungs, just a wet, gurgling sound that might have been my last breath. I was dying. I knew it with absolute certainty, felt it in the cold spreading from my chest, in the way the world was dimming around me. But I wasn't dead yet. I could still see, still hear, still feel. I heard Tom's voice, shouting something I couldn't make out, and then a las beam passed so close to my face, I felt the heat of it. I saw Joss fall. Finally, his body collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. I saw the hormagaunts swarming over him, tearing him apart, and I wanted to close my eyes, wanted to let the darkness take me, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in my dying body, forced to witness the end. And then, impossibly, the chittering stopped. The swarm pulled back, retreating into the tunnels as quickly as they'd come. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. Why would they leave? We were finished, helpless, easy prey. But they were gone, and the cavern was silent, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing and the drip of blood on stone. Tom was beside me, his face a mask of blood and grime. "Don't move," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're hurt bad. If you move, you'll bleed out faster." I tried to answer, but all that came out was a cough that sent fresh agony lancing through my chest. I could taste blood, copper, and salt, filling my mouth. Tom was pressing something against my wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, but I could feel the warmth spreading beneath me, pooling on the stone. I was dying. The only question was how long it would take. Why did they leave? I managed to gasp out, each word an effort. Tom didn't answer right away. He was looking past me, his augmetic eye glowing faintly in the darkness, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before. Fear. Not the adrenaline-fueled terror of combat, but a deeper, more primal dread. "Because something bigger is coming," he said finally. "They're clearing out, making room." I felt it then, a vibration in the stone beneath me, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat. It was getting stronger, closer, and with it came a sound, a low, thrumming hum that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity, in my bones. I tried to lift my head, to see what was coming, but the effort was too much. My vision was graying at the edges, the world narrowing to a tunnel that was getting smaller by the second. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was a shape emerging from one of the tunnels, massive and terrible, its body too large for the space, its form defying description. It was pale, almost translucent, and I could see organs pulsing beneath its skin, could see fluids circulating through veins as thick as my arm. It had no eyes, or too many eyes, or eyes that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and as it passed by me, over me, through me, I couldn't tell. I felt something reach into my mind, cold and alien, probing my thoughts with an intimacy that was more violating than any physical wound. It knew me. It knew everything about me. My name, my history, my fears, my regrets. It peeled away the layers of my consciousness like skinning a fruit, exposing the raw, vulnerable core beneath. I tried to resist, tried to hold on to some sense of self, but it was useless. I was nothing to this creature, less than nothing, just data to be catalogued and consumed. And in that moment of absolute helplessness, of complete violation, I understood the truth. The Tyranids weren't just killing us, they were learning us, absorbing everything we were, adding our experiences and knowledge to the hive mind's vast repository. We would never truly die, because we would become part of them, our memories and thoughts repurposed, recycled, used to make the swarm stronger, smarter, more efficient. I was being digested. Not my body that was still bleeding out on the cavern floor, but my mind, my soul, whatever essential part of me had once been human. And the worst part, the part that broke something fundamental inside me, was that I couldn't even muster the energy to care. The terror had faded, replaced by a strange, dreamy acceptance. This was always how it was going to end. From the moment I'd put on the uniform, from the moment I'd sworn to serve the Emperor, I'd been walking toward this cavern, this moment, this fate. The Imperium had chewed me up and spat me out, and now the Tyranids would finish the job. There was a symmetry to it, a horrible, perfect symmetry. I died in that cavern, or I thought I did. Death is supposed to be an ending, a cessation, but there was no such mercy for me. Instead, there was a transition, a shift from one state to another. My body failed, I felt my heart stop, felt my lungs cease their desperate attempts to draw breath, but my consciousness persisted, trapped in the cooling meat, that had once been me. I could still feel, still perceive, though the sensations were muted, distant, as if I were experiencing them through layers of insulation. I felt them lift me, multiple limbs, mandibles and claws, carefully, almost gently. They carried me through the tunnels, deeper into the earth, deeper into the hive. The journey was endless, or perhaps only seconds' time had lost all meaning. I was aware of heat, of moisture, of the press of biomass on all sides. I was aware of other bodies, other consciousnesses, a vast network of minds all connected, all thinking as one, the hive mind. It was there, always there, a presence at the edge of my awareness that was simultaneously alien and familiar. They brought me to a chamber, a womb of flesh and chitin, and placed me in a pool of thick, viscous fluid. It was warm, almost comforting, and I felt it seeping into my wounds, into my mouth and nose, filling me. I should have drowned, I should have suffocated, but I didn't. Instead, I felt the fluid integrating with me, bonding with my tissues, rewriting my biology on a cellular level. The pain returned then, not the sharp agony of combat wounds, but a deep, pervasive ache, as my body was unmade and remade. I could feel my flesh softening, dissolving, being broken down into component parts. I could feel new structures growing, unfamiliar organs and limbs emerging from the soup of what I had been. I tried to scream, but I had no mouth anymore. I tried to claw my way out of the pool, but I had no arms, no hands, just shapeless appendages that refused to obey. I was trapped, imprisoned in a body that was no longer mine, forced to endure every moment of the transformation, and through it all, the hive mind watched, catalogued, learned. It was curious about me, about the human experience of pain and fear and despair. It wanted to understand what it meant to be individual, to be separate, before it erased that separation forever. How long did it take? Days? Weeks? There was no way to measure time in the womb, no reference point except the slow dissolution of my identity. Memories began to slip away, experiences I'd once cherished becoming fragmented, meaningless. I forgot my mother's face, the sound of her voice. I forgot the names of the men I'd served with, the campaigns I'd fought in. I forgot what it felt like to laugh, to feel sunlight on my skin, to taste clean water. Everything that had made me human was being stripped away, layer by layer, until all that remained was a core of consciousness, a tiny spark of awareness, drowning in an ocean of alien thought. And then, when there was almost nothing left of me, when I was on the verge of complete dissolution, the transformation stopped. I was pulled from the pool, born again into a world I barely recognized. I had a body, though it was not the body I remembered. It was larger, stronger, covered in plates of chitin that gleamed wetly in the bioluminescent light. I had limbs, 4 of them, ending in scything talons that could tear through ceramite and flesh with equal ease. I had a tail, a whip-like appendage tipped with a venomous spike. I had mandibles, compound eyes, organs whose function I couldn't name but could feel working inside me, processing, adapting, preparing me for my new purpose. I was a hormagaunt, or something like one, a lesser synapse creature, still connected to the hive mind but with a vestige of individual awareness, a ghost of who I had been. They'd kept just enough of me intact to make use of my knowledge, my experience. I was a weapon now, a tool, shaped and honed for the purpose of killing the very people I had once fought beside. And the horror of it, the cosmic joke that the universe had decided to play on me, was that I couldn't refuse. I couldn't resist. The hive mind's will was absolute, and I was part of it now, a neuron in its vast, distributed brain. I was marched out of the womb chamber, joining a swarm of my new brothers and sisters, creatures that had once been human or xenos or something else entirely, all of us united in service to the hive. We moved through the tunnels, following chemical signals and psychic imperatives that I understood without conscious thought. We were going to the surface, to the ruins of the settlement where I had fought and died. The Imperium, had sent reinforcements, a new regiment, fresh meat to feed the digestion pools, and we were going to meet them. I tried to stop myself. I tried to hold back, to refuse the commands that flooded my mind, but it was impossible. My body moved without my consent, driven by instincts that had been engineered into me at a genetic level. I scuttled across the purple creep, my talons finding purchase easily on the slick surface, my new body perfectly adapted to this alien landscape. Around me, the swarm chittered and clicked, 1,000 voices harmonizing into a single purpose. I could feel their excitement, their hunger, their eagerness to feed, and beneath it all, I could feel my own despair, a tiny, impotent thing crushed beneath the weight of the hive mind. We reached the settlement as the sun was setting, that same pale, sickly sun I'd watched rise a lifetime ago. The Imperial forces had dug in, established a perimeter, and were waiting with lasguns and prayers. I could see them clearly now, my compound eyes resolving details that my human vision never could. I saw the fear on their faces, the way their hands trembled as they checked their charge packs. I saw the commissar, standing behind the line with his bolt pistol drawn, ready to execute any man who broke. I saw the medics, working frantically to treat injuries that couldn't be healed, and the priests, chanting their litanies, trying to bolster morale with promises of the Emperor's protection. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to tell them to run, to flee, to abandon this doomed world and never look back. But I had no voice. I had no agency. I was just another creature in the swarm, and the swarm was hungry. The attack began with the same terrible efficiency I'd experienced from the other side. We surged forward in a wave, covering the ground with inhuman speed, our bodies low and serpentine. The lasguns opened fire, red beams cutting through the twilight, and I felt the deaths of my swarm mates as they fell, each one a pinprick of pain in the collective consciousness. But we didn't slow down. We didn't hesitate. For every one of us that died, 2 more took its place, and the distance between us and the Imperial line shrank with every second. I was in the second wave, close enough to see individual faces now, close enough to recognize expressions I'd worn myself not so long ago. Terror, determination, resignation. These men were me. They were every guardsman who'd ever put on a uniform and been told to hold the line against impossible odds. And I was going to kill them. We hit the barricades like a tsunami, claws and teeth and rage. I saw myself, the old me, the human me, reflected in the eyes of a guardsman, as my talons took his head off. I felt his blood spray across my carapace, hot and slick, and some distant part of me wanted to vomit, to scream, to do anything but keep killing. But the hive mind didn't care about my trauma, my guilt, my horror. It wanted efficiency, and I was efficient. My body knew exactly how to kill, which angles to strike from, which targets to prioritize. I was a perfect predator, and the battlefield was my hunting ground. The Imperial line collapsed within minutes. The survivors broke and ran, just like my regiment had, and the commissar executed a fleeing trooper with his bolt pistol, just as I'd seen before. I watched the man's head explode, watched his body crumple, and I felt nothing. The capacity for grief had been excised from me, along with everything else that made me human. I was hollow, an empty shell filled with the hive mind's will, and I would continue to be hollow until my body finally broke down and was recycled into the biomass. We pursued them through the ruins, hunting them down one by one, dragging them back to the digestion pools to be processed, analyzed, integrated. Some of them fought to the end, going down swinging, their faith in the Emperor unshaken even as they died. Others begged, pleaded, offered surrender or service, or anything that might buy them another few moments of life. It made no difference. The Tyranids don't negotiate, don't take prisoners, don't show mercy. They just consume, and through it all, I was there, participating, complicit, unable to stop myself or even look away. I was a witness to my own damnation, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. I lost track of how many I killed. Dozens, certainly, maybe hundreds. Time blurred, the battles blending together into an endless cycle of violence and consumption. The planet was dying, being slowly digested by the hive fleet, and I was one of countless millions of creatures facilitating that process. Weeks passed, or months. I couldn't tell anymore. My sense of self, already fragmented, continued to erode. There were moments when I forgot I had ever been human, when the hive mind's thoughts were my thoughts, and the distinction between us vanished completely. But then, something would trigger a memory, a familiar smell, a sound, a pattern of light across the creep, and I would remember. I would remember being a guardsman, being a man, being afraid and tired and alive. And in those moments, the agony of what I had become was unbearable. I wanted to die. I wanted oblivion, an end to the consciousness that persisted like an infection. But death was not an option. My body was too resilient, too efficient, regenerating from wounds that would have killed my human form instantly. And even if my body did fail, my genetic material would be recycled, my memories and experiences preserved in the hive mind's vast library. There was no escape, no release, no mercy. I was eternal, and eternity was suffering. The planet fell. Completely, absolutely. Every human on it either died or was absorbed. Every structure either destroyed or repurposed into the hive's biomass infrastructure. The atmosphere changed, the oxygen content dropping as the Tyranids metabolized it, replacing it with gases that suited their biology. The oceans were drained, the minerals extracted, the very bedrock cracked open and consumed. The world that had once had a name, Terteus 9, or something like it, became just another corpse, a husk stripped of everything useful, left spinning in the void as the hive fleet moved on to its next meal, and I went with them. Along with the rest of the swarm, I was loaded into a bioship, a living vessel that was part creature and part spacecraft. Its interior, a labyrinth of passages lined with pulsing organs and dripping ichor. We were packed in tight, hundreds of us in a space barely large enough for dozens, but discomfort didn't register. We didn't need comfort. We didn't need anything except to fulfill our purpose. The journey through the void was indescribable. There were no viewports, no way to see the stars or the empty blackness of space. But I could feel the ship moving, could sense the vast distances being traversed. I could feel the hunger of the hive mind, an endless, gnawing appetite that could never be satisfied. It was looking for the next target, the next world to devour, and when it found one, we would drop from the sky like a plague, and the cycle would begin again. I thought about the Imperium, about the billions of guardsmen just like me, fighting and dying on 1,000 different worlds, none of them knowing that their fate was to be consumed, digested, repurposed into the very thing they fought against. I thought about the lies we'd been told, the promises of glory and honor and the Emperor's protection. I thought about how meaningless it all was, how insignificant. The Tyranids weren't evil, they weren't cruel, they simply were. A force of nature as indifferent as gravity or entropy, and they would continue to exist long after the Imperium had collapsed and humanity had gone extinct. I would be part of that extinction. I would kill my own kind, over and over, on world after world, until there were no more worlds left to consume. And through it all, I would remain aware, trapped in this prison of flesh and chitin, forced to witness every atrocity, every murder, every moment of suffering I caused. This was my punishment, my eternal damnation, not for any sin I'd committed, but simply for having the misfortune to exist in a universe where gods were hungry and mercy was a fairy tale. If you're hearing this, and I don't know how you could be, unless some fragment of my thoughts has survived in the hive mind's memory banks and been recovered by someone foolish enough to probe a Tyranid corpse, then know this: the war is already lost. The Imperium is doomed, humanity is doomed, everything you love and value is doomed. The Tyranids are coming, an endless swarm that sweeps across the galaxy like a tide, and there is no force in the universe that can stop them. All you can do is die well, die quickly, and pray to whatever God you believe in, that your consciousness doesn't persist after your body fails. Because if it does, if some spark of who you are remains after the consumption, then you'll end up like me, a ghost in a monster's shell, watching through alien eyes as your new body tears apart everyone and everything you once cared about. And that, I promise you, is a fate worse than any death. The Emperor does not protect. The Emperor cannot protect. The Emperor is either dead or a corpse on a throne, and his Imperium is built on the bones of trillions of souls who believed in lies. I was one of those souls. I believed I was fighting for something greater than myself, that my sacrifice would mean something. But it didn't. It meant nothing. I was just meat, and now I'm something worse than meat. I'm a tool, a weapon, a cog in a machine that exists only to devour. This is my confession. This is my warning. This is the last human thought I will ever have, before the hive mind subsumes what remains of my consciousness completely. Remember me, if you can. Remember the guardsman who fought on Terteus 9, who died in a cavern full of bones, who was reborn as a monster. Remember what happened to me, and know that it can happen to you, will happen to you. If you're unlucky enough to face the Tyranids and lose, the galaxy is a meat grinder, and we are the grist. That's all we ever were. That's all we'll ever be. And when the last human has been consumed, when the last world has been stripped clean, when the Tyranids have eaten everything there is to eat, maybe then there will be silence. Maybe then there will be peace. But I won't be there to see it. I'll be long gone, dissolved into the collective, my identity scattered across 1 billion different bodies, each one a fragment of who I used to be. I was a guardsman. My name was I can't remember anymore. The hive mind has taken even that from me. But I was human once. I felt pain and fear and hope and love. I laughed and cried and dreamed of a future that would never come. And now I'm nothing. Less than nothing. A memory fading into the vast, hungry darkness. This is how the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a chittering,